Okay, good day, everyone. Good evening or afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to another of these Zoom sessions at the Begin Center. Many of you have been on several of these before. You've heard a number of discussions and lectures about Israeli politics, about Israeli history, the wider Middle East, the Jewish world, and we're continuing this evening with an extremely current and hugely important issue, something which is, as I said, both contemporaneous, that you'll read about in your newspapers and see on the BBC and CNN and elsewhere today, but also I think will be talked about and written about an awful lot in years to come, namely the so-called Abraham Accords, Israel's signing of normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain, the first agreements with Arab states since the signing of the peace treaty with Jordan in the early 90s. We have with us a wonderful speaker and someone who's been writing and covering this story for the Jerusalem Post for several months. I'll introduce her momentarily. Let me just say that for those of you new to this format, after the initial presentation, after an initial discussion between myself and our speaker, the floor will be open for you to ask questions. You can do so by writing them into the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will read them out. Okay, without further ado, I shall introduce Lahav Harkov, the senior contributing editor of the Jerusalem Post, Jerusalem Post's diplomatic correspondent, analyzing and reporting on Israel's relations with the world, the Prime Minister's Office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, and more. She was previously the Jerusalem Post's reporter in the Knesset for over 8 years and was also the newspaper's news editor and managing editor of jpost.com. She's a frequent speaker on Israeli government and politics to a number of organizations, including AIPAC, the Conference of Presidents, Honors Reporting, and others. She's appeared on international news outlets such as the BBC, France 24, CTV, and Sky News, and she's been published in a number of American titles as well. She is herself originally from the United States, growing up in New Jersey, moving to Israel at the age of 17, where she did 2 years of Shirut Leumi, national service, at museums dealing with Jewish and Israeli history, including, I'm very happy to say, the Begin Center. And she has a degree in political science and communications from Bar-Ilan. And most importantly, of course, she lives in Tel Aviv with her husband and 2 children. Lahav Harkov, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. I love working with the Begin Center since I was 18 years old, as you mentioned.
Okay, so thank you. So as I said, we're going to have a discussion for about 20 minutes or so and see if we can also encourage and inspire some questions from the audience. We'll get to sort of where we are now with these agreements, but I want to first go back a little to, I think it was August, when you flew to Abu Dhabi as part of a delegation of journalists who were accompanying the Israeli official delegation to the Emirati capital, and you wrote a great piece in the Jerusalem Post entitled "Israel UAE Putting Cynicism Aside for Peace," which was a kind of more sort of personal take, describing your personal hope and excitement about what may be about to transpire, maybe about to develop. Can you just say a little bit about sort of what you were feeling going there and what you thought this could mean for Israel and maybe the wider region?
Yeah, I mean, I felt just incredibly excited and really happy. And as a journalist, I think there's not, especially journalists who deals with sort of political things and now diplomatic things, there's not a lot of opportunities to have a story that is just, it really fills you with a lot of joy and hope. And that was really what I was feeling. And I think I've gotten a lot of feedback about that article. I think a lot of people could really sense that. I think it's rare to hear that from someone who's reporting on a news story. But this was the rare story that just felt purely positive. And you know, there's some details and things that people brought up, things that there's things to be discussed, and we always want to be critical and I look at things critically. But I just, I felt and I still feel that this is sort of Israel turning a page. And it's a certain, you know, effort made by Israel over recent decades that finally has been bearing fruit. And I just felt like it was a beautiful thing. I mean, and I still do. And I still think that there are more to come. I mean, it's still a developing story.
Right. So, okay. So we'll definitely get to that, to the developing story. But I'm interested in how long were you there for? How long were you in the country for?
So we were only there for, I guess, like a day and a half. We only spent one night there. We arrived at the presidential airport, so it wasn't like the main commercial airport, but it was still, they'd rolled out the red carpet for us, and well, not for us reporters, but for the delegation. And, you know, there was a row of flags, you know, Emirati flags and Israeli flags waving together. And, you know, just getting off the plane and seeing that was like an amazing start to the trip. And then there were statements to the press. And it's interesting that the leadership in the Emirates is sort of famously press shy, which I learned on the trip. So what was a little strange was that Mayor Ben Shabbat, the national security advisor, he made a statement in Arabic, actually, and in Hebrew, but first in Arabic. And then Jared Kushner said a few words. And then there was no one from the Emirates who said anything, even though there were officials who met the group. So we were like, this is a little strange. We later learned that they're actually very quiet and discreet. You know, it's not a democratic country. They don't have to face people as much as our leaders do, and American leaders. But it was very interesting to see that ceremony just on arrival. And then we were all staying in the same hotel to be in a semi-coronavirus bubble situation. We were discouraged from leaving the hotel, although some reporters did. I only left with the group because I was concerned about coronavirus. But anyway, we got to the hotel and the government officials immediately started their meetings. And there was sort of an interesting setup. You know, like many hotels, there's all kinds of conference rooms. So each one had like a sign outside the door that said a different topic, whether it was civil aviation or diplomacy or health or space exploration. And they had officials from the government, from each government, sitting across from each other. And then they had one American official in the room to be like sort of a facilitator, like a rapporteur. So we weren't really allowed to sit in on the meetings, but I was allowed to get a little peek. So I was in a bunch of different rooms for a few seconds, and it was interesting. My understanding is that, you know, in some places it was really just getting to know you and what is your country doing? What is your country doing? In some places, some of the rooms, they had ties already for a while. And so they were able to just sort of pick up where they'd left off and do things in a more public manner. Health cooperation, for example, had been going on since the beginning of coronavirus pandemic. I had done some of the big reporting on that, actually. And also, of course, the Emiratis sent a plane of aid to the Palestinians, which the Palestinians then rejected. So it was interesting. The Palestinians sort of had the foresight. I wouldn't say it was the wisdom, but they had the foresight to see that the Emiratis sending an Etihad plane to Ben Gurion Airport was a step towards normalization, even though most people in Israel had no idea that that's what was happening. But yeah, so we were there, and then they sort of whisked us journalists away because they wanted to show us a good time. And they took us, there's a branch of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. And they took us on a tour of that branch of the Louvre. And I found, first of all, very interesting that, you know, talk about like Muslims are not supposed to paint sort of art of the human form or have that kind of art hanging up, but it was a normal art museum in that way. There were still, you know, portraits of people and statues of people. And they have a whole exhibit that's very focused on religious tolerance, which is also one of the themes, of course, of the Abraham Accords. And sort of, I think for us Israelis, that's like less of a big deal. But in Abu Dhabi, and in a lot of the remarks that Emirati officials have made, you can see that is actually an important emphasis for them. Like the Jews and Muslims sort of tolerance and coexistence. So they showed us that in the Louvre, they had a room that had religious art mainly from the three monotheistic religions, but also Buddhists and things like that as well. And it was interesting to see there was a Torah there. There was a Chumash from Yemen that was, the words were written to make out like a flower. So it was interesting to see that sort of style of art. And then we had this dinner that I think was maybe the most enlightening thing on the entire trip, where we finally got to speak to people unscripted. I mean, I'm sure these people were carefully chosen to make a good impression, right? They didn't choose people who would be hostile to the idea, I'm sure. But you still got to have a conversation person to person. I sat in between two women. There weren't only women at the table, and just to clarify, because people ask me this question all the time, I wore my normal clothes. I tried to dress modestly out of respect, but I wore normal, I didn't cover my hair all the time and things like that. But I was sitting in between two women. One was a young diplomat at the Foreign Ministry, and the other one was a manager of a history museum on the history of the Emirates, which we later ended up going to that museum. There was a little extra time on the schedule, so that was nice. But it was interesting to hear from people their impressions of Israel. A lot of people sort of in the elite in the Emirates study abroad. It was pretty common, I think, among the sort of elite, sort of upper class of the Arab world in general, to study in New York, to study in London. So a lot of them actually had Israeli friends, and they were really excited to be able to go and visit those friends and see all the places they'd heard about. They asked me about Tel Aviv. The diplomat at the Foreign Ministry told me she really likes hiking, so I told her about the Israel Trail. And she told me about camping in the Emirates, which is not something I had ever really thought of, right? It's not really what you think of when you go to Dubai and go camping. But it was just like really interesting to talk about things on that level, as opposed to just, the big story here about, Israel and being able to make peace in the region and to be able to be of the Middle East and not just this walled off entity. But to hear also just what regular people heard, think. So that was the first day. On the second day, most of it was spent going to the big mosque in Abu Dhabi, the Sheikh Zayed Mosque, which is beautiful. It's like the Taj Mahal. It's massive and beautiful and incredibly ornate. There we had to dress, according to Muslim rules. I had to wear a hijab. I had to wear like an abaya, like the robe. There was a photograph, actually from my phone, of the 4 female journalists in the Israeli delegation dressed like that. And I sent it to the WhatsApp group of all the journalists, and we're not entirely sure who's responsible, but somebody got that picture on social media and it went very viral. It didn't bother me, but some of the reporters felt like maybe it was disrespectful. So some of the reporters were bothered by it. But in any case, it became sort of this big internet sensation back home, which was also interesting to see. And so that's more or less what happened on the trip. It was not a very long trip, but we got to see a lot of aspects, I think, of the UAE, because we got to see a bit of the government aspect. We got to see, a little bit of the tourism, between the Louvre and the mosque, and we got to really speak to people who work in culture and in diplomacy. At some of the other tables at their dinner, there was like the head of their space project. All kinds of things like that, and then hear from just interesting people who live there and get a broader sense of the place and their views on Israel.
Wow, that's quite an experience. I wonder, one of the things that struck me reading your piece and also listening to you now, and other things that I've read, is how when we think of, traditionally, I think here in Israel, we think of the Arab world and we think of our immediate neighborhood and our immediate neighbors. And we think of Jordan and Egypt, that yes, we have peace with, but it's a cold peace. And we think of Syria, which is basically a mess and full of, a sort of genocidal regime on the one hand and genocidal Islamists on the other hand, and Iran playing around in there as well. And then Lebanon, which is also sort of under the heel of Iran through Hezbollah. And this is, it sounds like, if it wasn't for the fact that we know they're Arabs, it's United Arab Emirates, and we know they're in the Middle East, it just sounds like a different world from what we think about when we think about the Arab world, right? And especially, or maybe maybe not especially, but I think an indication of that is what you just said about how they hold that focus on interfaith, the focus on showcasing their tolerance of Jews. It's almost like counterintuitive. It's become counterintuitive because of how we think about Israel's relations with the Arab world, where the conflict isn't just about land and politics. It's also increasingly, because of political Islam, it's become about religion and that kind of thing. Did it surprise you, that kind of the way they thought about Jews, that positive way?
Yeah, I found it fascinating. I mean, I think that the UAE and Dubai specifically is known to be a pretty, cosmopolitan kind of place that people from all over the world come there and do business. And that, the Emiratis, the citizens, right, are known to be sort of wealthy and in all the top universities of the world, you have like Arab exchange students. So that part didn't really surprise me so much. But the fact that they saw their role, or they felt that they couldn't truly be of the world if they weren't willing to tolerate other people, that they realized that this in part is like it's sort of a key to their development and to being an important country on the world stage. And I found that a pretty amazing insight, one that I agree with, and I was impressed by it. I asked two different tour guides at the Louvre, and they had like a statue of like Jesus on the cross, and I was like, isn't this a problem for religious Muslims? Like it's a human figure, not a very modest one either, if you think of most pictures like that. And they said, no, we want to tolerate everyone, we want to show all the different religions. And you talk to people in the community in the Emirates, the small Jewish community. And I spoke to people in person, and I've since read a few articles that people have written about life there. And they say that the men don't necessarily wear kippah in public, but they're not worried about the Emiratis themselves. They're worried about the large population of foreign workers who come from places like Pakistan. The Emiratis themselves, I say it's no problem. They can talk about being Jewish, and it only happened this year that the community got like an official status. And they're building a synagogue. But I interviewed the mashgiach, the kosher supervisor that came on the trip, because I just found that it was, when I ate dinner at the Louvre, it was a catered kosher meal for me. And I've been on trips like this, and a lot of times you just get basically like airplane food in a tray while everyone else is eating their fancy 3-course dinner, But this felt equal to everything else. So when I bumped into the kosher supervisor in the elevator of the hotel, I said, I have to hear about this. And he said to me that everything he wanted, they went and they got very quickly. There was some sort of sauce that the caterer was making that needed truffles, and they brought him, like, it was like truffles in wine or something. And he said, we can't have this because wine isn't kosher. And they went back and they brought him more truffles. Truffles are an extremely expensive ingredient, but it was like, no, they'll bring anything needed for this trip. They wanted to make, the delegates, Mayor Ben Shabbat and Avi Berkowitz from the U.S. and everyone else who was keeping kosher, feel very comfortable and feel very welcome, which I guess goes to the stereotype of Arab hospitality, but in this case, it was true. Yeah.
Wow. And then moving on, sort of, was it a few weeks later? There was the signing ceremony in Washington, and there was a kind of surprise, which was maybe a little less of a surprise because it had been trailed a bit, that Bahrain were also going to be part of the agreement. We now know it's a little less of a complete agreement, I think, with Bahrain, right?
Yeah, I think Bahrain was maybe a little bit less prone to theatrics than the UAE. And that's really where the difference comes to in the end. Look, we've never been at war with those countries. Now, I think people who say this isn't a big deal because we weren't at war with those countries, I think they're wrong. But legally, Bahrain said, well, that they don't want it to be a peace, that they don't think it makes sense to be a peace treaty. So that's why Bahrain didn't do it. But the UAE was I guess they're a little flashier, and we're happy to make it a peace treaty and to continue with that. But I think in practicality, it will be the same, right? We're going to have full diplomatic relations with both countries. In the case of UAE, I think they're going to be investing a ton in Israel. I actually just wrote an article today, which I encourage everyone to look up, but if you have questions, you could ask me about it. But I've started to get a sense from reading some people who are close to the Trump administration and talking to a couple of people that the U.S. hopes that the UAE's investments in Israel will be at a magnitude that will weaken the economic ties between Israel and China, which is an aspect that I certainly didn't think of until a few days ago, and I haven't seen a lot of people write about. So, but Bahrain is different in that respect, that they don't necessarily have the capacity to have that kind of economic impact, but it's still, to have an ally in the region, to have an ally that's so with such close proximity to Iran is very important.
Right. And I think, as I understand it, one of the important differences maybe between Bahrain and the UAE is that unlike the UAE, Bahrain has, I think, a majority Shiite population, which and there's at least a possibility that there's greater dissonance between the government and the population on this issue, right? Is that right?
Yes. I will say that going into this week, at the beginning of this week, there was a Israeli delegation that went to Bahrain, and I did not join them this time. The coronavirus situation is a lot worse now, so I had to stay home. But they, before the trip, there were no sort of previews or anything in their media. There was nothing in the news or in the newspapers or anything, and they had asked Israelis, in reporting, you have something called an embargo, where you can't publish something until a certain hour, and it's an agreement you make, a certain time, a certain date, is an agreement you make in order to get that information. So the embargo on the story was until that morning when the flight was going to head to Bahrain. And I sort of read into it as an indication that they were worried about maybe security of the trip, of the population not liking it. But then the following morning's newspapers all had the trip on the cover, so they weren't really hiding it. Maybe it was a security issue in advance, that they didn't want someone to show up to the ceremony, but they're not hiding it. So there's that. Okay.
Can you say a little about, because I know you were also you were at the ceremony in DC. Can you say a little bit about that, about the ceremony itself, and what you took from that, both maybe the occasion itself, but also the statements from Netanyahu, from Trump, and from the officials from Bahrain and the UAE who were there?
Yeah, first of all, the trip was hugely overshadowed just by coronavirus things. If someone asked me about that trip, that sadly is like the first thing I think of, because in the Israeli news, it was like a few days before we were all going to lockdown for Rosh Hashanah, and in the American news, these stories actually have not made such huge waves in the U.S. Broadly, there's certain areas where people did focus on it more. But the ceremony itself was clearly drawn up to be sort of a hugely symbolic and an event that can be photographed and seen in history books, where you have Netanyahu and these two Arab foreign ministers all on the South Lawn in the White House, all on this, behind this big desk that they told us was made out of mahogany. So, we could use those descriptions in our news articles, and sign these documents and hold them up. So it was just very full of sort of pomp and circumstance. And then you have President Trump who doesn't do pomp and circumstance. And so, and has his sort of, the common touch, I guess. And it was an interesting contrast. I was one of the reporters who got to go into the Oval Office. Not everyone gets to go, and it's sort of chosen randomly. And so that was like, well, I think in some ways that's the fun thing, or, for better or worse, about President Trump, right? Like, you hear him talk in the Oval Office, and he has his own sort of jocular way of talking about things. And then we go outside for the actual ceremony, and then it's much more straight-laced, It was also just really interesting to see in the ceremony how many kippahs were in the audience. So many religious Jews, and I just don't think that that's the norm for, you know, any U.S. administration. But it was a huge Jewish event. You know, it wasn't just the Martin Indyk and Aaron David Millers of Washington, who were also there, but it was also, you know, a lot of rabbis and a lot of people who were really in the Jewish community. So I thought that that was interesting as well.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one final question, which is kind of a political question, and then we'll get to the questions which are already coming in from participants. So one of the problems, I guess, with these accords is that they were signed by an Israeli prime minister who divides opinion very strongly, and sponsored by an American president who divides opinion very strongly. And so people who don't like Trump or Netanyahu or both, at least some of them, are sort of kind of, at least the way I've been reading some of this, sort of down on the agreement, right? They're saying, you know, it was for political expediency on one or both cases, or if they do accept that it's a good thing, they'll sort of try and downplay the credit that either Netanyahu or Trump deserve for it. And of course, on the other side, Trump and Netanyahu's cheerleaders are like, this shows what amazing statesmen these two leaders are. So do you think, I guess the question is, to what extent, how much credit do you think Netanyahu and Trump deserve for this? Your personal take on it, and like how much of it is something which might have happened anyway with a different American president or a different Israeli prime minister?
I think Netanyahu deserves a lot of credit, and I think the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit, which is a lot how American presidents work, that they sign off on things in the end. But I'll tell you what Trump personally deserves credit for is that his personality and his way of doing things is that he does not accept the common wisdom, and he wants to look at things in a different way, and he has his way of looking at things as a businessman, right? And you know, what's in it for this person, what's in it for that person, and it's, you know, he looks at things with in completely different eyes, and that, you know, trickles down throughout the whole administration and all of the officials working with him. So that's where I give Trump credit. But the actual work in the Gulf, his people in his administration, did a lot of work on this issue. And if you look back at comments they had made over the previous few years, there had been a lot of comments that, you know, they didn't say specifically, oh, it's our goal to get full diplomatic ties, but they talked about it, how these are countries that have some form of ties, and that, you know, it's you know, they even said, I don't know if they used the word ridiculous, but they said ridiculous or absurd, or it doesn't make sense that they don't have ties. So start with that. And then with Netanyahu, I think he deserves a huge amount of credit. Look, he says it himself. You don't have to believe him when he gives himself credit, but I do think he's right that the fact that Netanyahu was able to take such a strong stand against Iran, even when that stand means going against the president of the United States when it was President Obama, and he spoke in Congress, and you know, and Obama was furious at him, as we all know. But he was still willing to do what he felt it would take to protect Israel from an existential threat, or, you know, a major threat, the biggest threat to Israel that exists now, at least from a security standpoint. That, you know, I think that they saw that, and they saw that this is someone we should be working with, because this is the person taking the strongest public stand on this issue. Sorry, excuse me a second. I need a tissue.
Sure.
Sorry.
Go for it. I'll fill in. So while we're waiting, I think that thank you, by the way, for all the questions that are coming in. While we're waiting, I'm going to tell everyone here, Lahav, I'm just taking the opportunity to say something
Sure.
about something else we're doing here at the center. While I've got everyone here, I wanted to say this at the end, but it might make more sense for me to say this now while everyone is still on. I know some people drop off a little early. We're doing here at the center some courses on a number of different topics, 6, 7, 8 week courses, which you can sign up for Most of them are in Hebrew, but 2 of them are in English. So I'm going to write in the chat box a link to the catalog for the courses. So I encourage you to look at those. And if you go to the last couple of pages, there are 2 excellent courses in English, one on Zionism and one on sort of security and geostrategic security issues in the world today, which we're doing in partnership with the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. So I'm going to put that in the chat box a little later. And back to you, Lahav.
Yeah, so, you know, and Netanyahu has this philosophy, and if you read his book, A Place Among the Nations, which came out 25 years ago, he's actually been very consistent with it. I don't know, you know, maybe people didn't think about it all the time, but this has been his position all along, that if Israel is strong and has a strong economy and has, you know, it has strong insecurity and has things to offer to the world instead of things that it needs to concede, that the world will want to do business with Israel. And I think that this really proves his point. I mean, you know, aside from the fact that Israel today has ties with more countries than it has ever had before, and this was something that happened in the last decade while he was prime minister, this is the truly revolutionary thing, that there are Arab countries that are willing to have full diplomatic relations with Israel, even though there's no progress on the Palestinian issue, and even though Israel is not willing to make major concessions on that front at the moment. Although, arguably, even the Trump plan has major concessions by Israel, because it would be 70% of Judea and Samaria. But it is, you know, conceding less than any other plan basically discussed. So, you know, and it's another way that the Trump administration made this happen, is that I think that the UAE probably was considering this move to some extent anyway of normalization with Israel, but I think that the Trump plan was sort of an impetus because they didn't want Israel to move forward with applying sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, and so they said, you know, we've been moving in the right direction. I mean, in that op-ed in Yediot, they said, we've been moving in the right direction, but that would be a step in the wrong direction. And that was what sort of inspired the Trump administration to say, wait, we can have an immediate victory with this. We can do this right now and have benefits for Israel and for security and stability in the Middle East, whereas our peace plan will be a long process. So let's do this thing right now that we can accomplish.
Right, and then there's all the debate within Israel as to whether Netanyahu himself wasn't so sold on the annexation plan, and this was a very useful way for him to get out of it as well, right? That he could get a huge diplomatic win, and then not have to do the annexation, which it's unclear he wanted to do.
Netanyahu is a very status quo person. He doesn't like to take big steps. He's a conservative person. But on the other hand, the plan was written with very close cooperation with Ambassador Dermer, and also with Dori Gold, the head of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, who's very close to Netanyahu. And it hews very closely to Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech from 2009, when he talked about what would be a two-state solution that he would be willing to accept. So it would be hard for me to say that he wasn't sold on the plan, because I think the plan really reflects his views of where Israel should move forward. The question, maybe he wasn't sold on the pace. Yeah,
so the plan, yes, but the question is whether Israel annexes, you know, whether Israel annexes in the absence of a Palestinian agreement to the plan, whether Israel goes ahead and annexes it anyway, which is what obviously the settler leadership wanted, and Netanyahu initially said he wanted, but it's not clear whether how much he wanted that personally, or whether he's willing to wait until the Palestinians say no, right? Because it seems like also Jared Kushner himself wasn't so keen on immediate annexation. There was some disagreement within the American administration.
I'll tell you the way I saw it, which was that when we were in, you know, the East Room of the White House in January, and the plan was presented, and then immediately after, all the Israeli journalists went to the Blair House, which is the guest house of the White House, and Netanyahu loves staying there. And so does Sarah Netanyahu. They love the Blair House, and which, you know, we can't blame them. It's a very cool, you know, and historic place. So we all sat around this giant table, which, by the way, actually ended up being the table that the peace agreements were signed on, because when they told us all about the table, a very strange press release, they did say that it was the dining room table from the Blair House. So in any case, we all sat around this table, all the journalists, and he said right there that next week at the cabinet meeting, we're going to apply Israeli sovereignty to all of the communities in Judea and Samaria. And then he had to take it back because Jared Kushner went on CNN a few hours later and said, oh, no, I don't think it's going to be that fast. So the way I see it, he intended to do it, but then the diplomatic and political reality was different and he had to change his plans. And it could be that because he had more time to think about it, that he, was less gung-ho. But overall, I think that he did plan at first to do it.
Got it. Okay. All right. So we're going to turn now to the number of questions that we've received. I also, by the way, I also have a request. I don't know whether this is to you or to both of us, probably to both of us, to speak more slowly. So I think we both have to speak more slowly. So one of the questions is that have the full accords now been disclosed, or are there any secret codicils that we don't yet know about? I mean, obviously we won't know what they are, but do we know that everything is now completely out of the open with these accords?
Well, I'll quote, I think it was Donald Rumsfeld who said that there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns. There are no secret parts that I am aware of. I believe that the F-35s were not actually part of this deal, and that's because I've heard it from officials in all three countries. That the UAE assumed that it would be easier for them to get F-35s as a result of this normalization, but it wasn't something that was part of the deal in an official capacity. And now they're moving forward, and we'll see what happens. I mean, the U.S. seems to want to sell it to them, but they might not sell it with all the advanced technology that Israel has, et cetera. Netanyahu did say that he's going to go to the Foreign Affairs and Defense Subcommittee on Intelligence in the Knesset, which is classified, and the protocols don't get released for 30 years to talk about these deals. So it makes me think there are some aspects the public doesn't know about. Also, the deals themselves are very short and very short on details. So, it could be the security cooperation, the intelligence cooperation, things like that are not out in the open, if I had to guess.
Got it. Okay. That makes some sense. There's a question just going back to a couple of questions actually that relate to your visit to the Emirates. One of the questions is I'll ask like two or three, and you can answer them at the same time. One of them is that outside of the question refers to Dubai, but I think it may be Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Outside of the big cities, Dubai and Abu Dhabi, are the Emiratis equally cultured and open to peace with Israel? Another question is, what advice would you give to prospective Israeli tourists regarding Islamic sensitivities?
Okay, I'm going to answer those. And I also saw there was another question about the foreign workers living in the Emirates.
Oh yeah, right. So that 90% of the population are
they're all really connected.
Okay.
Right. So the Emiratis are only about 20% of the population of the Emirates. And they're sort of the elite in the country, and the rest of the people are foreign workers. And that's foreign workers ranging from, a CEO of a company based in Dubai to, the janitor. It's hard to know what those people think. Those people would be probably more cautious because, they could be kicked out of the country very easily. In the hotel, everybody was very cordial to us. But the impression I got from people in the Jewish community is that those are some of the people that they're more concerned about rather than the Emiratis themselves. And I don't think it's an issue of outside Dubai and Abu Dhabi. I think it's more of the issue of locals versus foreigners, and who's sort of educated and who's not and things like that. The other issue is, I guess, tips for visitors. I was only in Abu Dhabi and not in Dubai. Dubai is really where there's a lot more tourism. And my understanding is that it's actually very open. And I have to say that I like seriously Googled it before visiting, like, what am I allowed to wear? What am I not allowed to wear? And the other female journalists who were going were all like, we're just going to wear our normal clothes. But the impression I got was that the tips were sort of to keep your shoulders covered, like don't wear tank tops, which I don't really do anyway, certainly not on a business trip. And other than that, like Western dress is fine. But of course, if you're going to the mosque, that you should really cover up. And they gave us these robes to wear over our clothes, and they also had hijabs, although I brought my own scarf, so I need to wear one that he knows who had worn it before. But overall, they're a place that's open to tourism, and they have a very international population, and those people don't have to dress in like full Islamic dress.
Okay. Well, there was one more question specifically about being there. Gentleman asks, Say mentions that he was in Dubai last year at a trade show with his American passport, and he said that all the business meetings I had, the people knew I lived in Israel, and they were very hospitable and friendly. They knew the reality of the Palestinian issue, but were not concerned. They realized that the Palestinians were being disingenuous. Did you have similar impressions? Did it come up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it did. Yeah, it came up a little, and the impression that I got was sort of that they were sort of taken aback by the Palestinian reaction. I mean, and remember, this was only 2 weeks after. After a little while, Abbas told the Palestinians they need to calm down and not antagonize the Emiratis so much. But I think this is when they were still antagonizing the Emiratis, and they were, burning pictures of the crown prince and things like that. And they were just like, we're a sovereign country who can do what we want to do, and we should do what's good for us. Like, as a sovereign country, like what we're doing for ourselves isn't hurting the Palestinians in any way. Like, they just didn't see it that way. In theory, they are still committed to a two-state solution and to the other elements of the Arab peace plan. But I think that they all sort of see the Palestinians as not able to make progress and improve their own lives.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That seems to be. That's something that comes across, and even in the statements by the leaders, I think that's sort of that skepticism about Palestinian intentions, maybe, or sincerity, I think comes across. Yeah,
and there was this interview, I think it was about 2 weeks ago now, by one of the Saudi princes, Prince Badr, his name is. He used to be the ambassador to the U.S., and he's very close to a lot of like major people in the U.S., like the Bushes and Dick Cheney, and etc. And he gave like this 3-part interview where he talked about the Palestinians, and it almost sounded like you were listening to like Abba Evans saying the Palestinians, or the Arabs, he said at the time, don't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And he went way back, and he talked about, that the Palestinians sympathizing with Hitler. Like, he went all the way back through history to say, like, that they always choose the wrong side in every conflict. He talked about Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War as well, and just that the Palestinians need to start making better choices for themselves because their leadership does a really bad job.
Right. Okay. We have a question which actually isn't on here, but because this is also being broadcast on our YouTube channel, and we have a question that's come up on YouTube, which is, and this is very, I think, a very good question. Is this new treaty strong enough to survive a possible Trump defeat in the coming elections? What will be different? What will be different if it's President Biden?
The way that question is worded, I think the answer is it won't be so different. But Biden is very positive about these deals, although he did mention in his statements that we still, there still needs to be talks with the Palestinians, et cetera. But, he had fully positive views on this, both in his immediate statement, but then he was asked about it later on. And so I don't think he's going to do anything that would jeopardize it. But I also don't think that he's going to actively push for more countries to do it the way the Trump administration is right now, because I think that this is Trump's greatest foreign policy achievement. David Friedman actually said that in a speech today, that this is like the crown jewel of Trump's foreign policy. So like, why would Biden just piggyback on Trump's foreign policy? You know, he's not going to make that a priority for himself, even just for political reasons. But I don't think that he's going to be an obstacle. And there's also a chance that he will bring countries together the way Obama did, which is, you know, by accident, by antagonizing countries and having a policy that those countries don't like, and then they come together. And specifically in the same way, because Biden says he wants to go back to the Iran deal. He says he wants to adjust it and make it stronger. But, you know, Israel, the problems with the Iran deal for Israel are just so huge that it's hard to see that any return based on that framework would be good for Israel. And I can't imagine that the UAE or the Saudis would be happy with any kind of deal that gives Iran a path to a bomb. So that's another way in which Biden could actually bring all these countries closer together, closer to Israel.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's we're coming up. It's almost decision day in America. Before I go on, I just want a show of hands or people nodding their heads. Can people hear a trumpet being played? Okay, so this.
Yeah, I hear something.
This is in my building. It's actually the security guard here at the Begin Center who is. It's just him and I in the building, and he's two floors below me, practicing his trumpet. So I'm going to ask Lahav another question, and while she's answering, I will, in 5 seconds, run to the door to close it. But I don't want to hold up the question. So I'm going to ask the question. Lahav, please answer, and I will just run off to close the door. Okay. There's a good question here. Jonah Pressman asked, he says, it might be important to discuss the bottom line differences between a peace treaty and a normalization treaty. Does one lead to the other? Does a peace treaty always lead to normalization? Does normalization treaty always lead to peace? The media and others seem to use the terms interchangeably when they are in fact completely different. Can Lahav address the lexicon and possible legal differences?
Someone just wrote the trumpet player is pretty good. Yeah, so normalization just means that you're establishing diplomatic ties. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you are in a state of hostility with the other country, right? And a peace treaty has to do with hostilities, which is why some people argue, oh, it's not really a peace treaty because the UAE and Israel were not at war. My argument on that front is, you know, any country that's in the Arab League and doesn't have diplomatic relations with Israel can be considered to be in some level of hostility against Israel because of the Arab League position. They never, you know, reversed their Khartoum decision from 1967. I mean, de facto, now 4 of them have gone against it, but I guess Syria technically too, because we did negotiate with Syria. But, you know, and so I just think that it's just like a sea change. It's just a huge change in the structure of the region, and I hope that it continues and there's a domino effect. But to the question at hand, right, they're not the same thing, right? Because a peace treaty usually is countries that are at war or in some sort of, you know, sort of de jure war, if not de facto.
Yeah.
Whereas normalization, again, could be between two countries that didn't have any kind of hostility between them. They just never had official diplomatic relations.
I should also mention a few weeks ago we had Michael Oren on this Zoom slot talking about the 6-Day War, and he was asked about what he thought about these things and the fact that they were quote unquote only normalization, and his view was that normalization is better than peace because we have peace with Egypt and Jordan, but we don't have normalization with Egypt and Jordan.
Good point.
Which is an interesting take. Okay, so Iran. A couple of questions on Iran. One from Jacqueline is whether you think that this accord would have happened if Iran wasn't so problematic, wasn't this enemy that focused the minds of not just Israel but also countries like the Emirates and Bahrain. And the other question, if there has been any glimpse of an Iranian reaction to these accords.
I mean, Iran has been furious, and they've said a lot of things, and they've called the UAE traitors to Islam, and repeatedly. That's been the Iranian reaction. I've not seen any violent reaction thus far. As for the other question, I mean, it's hard to, rewrite history in that way, but definitely the issue of Iran and U.S. negotiations with Iran brought Israel and the UAE together. It was sort of an open secret in Washington already back in 2015 that Ron Dermer and Youssef Al-Otaiba, the Emirati ambassador to Washington, were friends and were talking, and they even spoke together to members of the Obama administration about, shared interests of the UAE and Israel when it comes to Iran. On the other hand, there are other things, there have been business ties. Now they're stronger because they can be more out in the open. So maybe it would have happened, but it would have been slower, I think.
Okay, and to move to another Middle Eastern country, Saudi Arabia. That would be the big prize, right? If we were to get a deal with them. Zev Portner in the UK asks if you think that the Saudis may cross the Rubicon and sign a deal like this, and if so, when?
So the big thing that a lot of commentators and analysts have said was that in Saudi Arabia, there's a generational divide, that King Salman feels very loyal to the Palestinian cause, and so he's not going to make a change. Whereas MBS, the Crown Prince, doesn't care as much. And Jeff Dowey, don't worry, I just have allergies. So yeah, that MBS is more enthusiastic about ties for Israel because he's more focused on the future and on economic ties and things like that, and doesn't feel as much of a personal connection to the Palestinians. That may be true, but then when that Saudi prince went on TV and just completely eviscerated the Palestinian leadership in 40 minutes, then you saw that even the older generation, because this is someone who's like 80 years old, he's the king's half brother. This is someone who's not. So, he doesn't feel so great about the Palestinians either. So it's interesting. I think, the Saudis, because they have Mecca and Medina in their country, they feel a sort of responsibility to the whole Muslim world. And that's sort of what's slowing them down at the moment. And so I think it'll take time, but they've already allowed flights going from Israel to the Gulf over their airspace, and I think that's no small thing.
Okay. Here's a great question from Jenny Tischler. She asks, many components of Israel's peace treaties with other Arab states never materialized. For example, economic cooperation with Jordan or the Red Sea Dead Sea project. How much of the immediate victory of the UAE deal could be overshadowed by an inability to follow through?
The way President Trump put it is that the other countries who made peace from Israel then had to ask for things from America. In other words, part of the deal of peace with Israel was that they got massive aid packages for America, whereas the UAE doesn't need aid packages for America. The F-35s they want, they can pay for on their own. So I think that in this case, when they've committed to investments and things like that, these are things that they want to do on their own. They don't need to be pushed and prodded to do it. Right. So I think it's sort of a different situation. I mean, there's a lot of things in those peace agreements that didn't materialize. I think a lot of people might not be aware of the fact that the peace with Egypt included autonomy for the Palestinians. So, Begin was sort of forced into that by Carter. But, it's true. And then there might be elements of this that don't go anywhere. There's cooperation in peaceful space exploration. I don't know where that's going. But the investments do seem to be going somewhere.
Okay. Well, there's a lot. This has inspired a lot of good debate.
Maybe we'll take two more questions.
Yeah, sure. So staying with the comparison with Egypt, Egypt recognized Israel and established diplomatic relations a long time ago, but the Emiratis seem a lot warmer towards Israel than the Egyptians. For example, Etihad Airlines have given a lot of publicity to the new flights, while Egypt Air seems embarrassed to admit they fly to Tel Aviv. What are your thoughts or comments about that?
Egypt Air doesn't just feed Emirates to fly to Tel Aviv. They don't list those flights. They're listed as like a fake separate airline called Sinai Air. It's like there's a whole, you can look it up online. It's like a really strange, there's been articles about this. But in any case, it's a more recent development though. Immediately after, like for years, I think Egypt Air did openly fly to Tel Aviv. But in any case, I just think that it's a very different population. It's also a different time, a different era where people are all connected and have the internet and they know things about Israel that they sort of wasn't as easy to find out when you live in a non-democratic country in 1978. And I think that the fact that these are people who traveled the world and studied around the world are a big factor, and those are the influential people here. And Egypt is a very poor country. I mean, there's just a lot of poor people in Egypt. I can't imagine that they've been traveling the world and that they've met very many people who aren't Egyptian. So it's just entirely different. And again, of course, you have to remember that in the Emiratis, it's 20% of the population that quote unquote matters when it comes to this kind of decision. So it's different in that way as well.
Right. It's a hugely different demographic economically, right. and I guess educationally. Okay, so final question for you. This is kind of bringing us very up to date. Jessica asks, what do you think ramifications will be of the way the Emiratis were treated by Jerusalem Arabs on the Temple Mount this week? Maybe you could give a little background for those that aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, there were some Emirati Arabs who visited Israel this week, and they went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, and some Palestinians harassed them and filmed them and put on the internet, and they were very proud of themselves. From what I saw, the Emiratis sort of thought that these people were idiots. And I saw Emiratis tweeting, thank God Israel controls Jerusalem, which is an astounding thing to hear from Arabs, I mean, really. But I saw it with my own eyes. I think, and I mentioned it earlier, that the Emiratis were kind of shocked by the hostile Palestinian reaction to this whole thing. And they feel like we're a sovereign country and we can do what we want, like who are the Palestinians to tell us who we're allowed to talk to. And so I think that's the impact. The Emiratis want to come and visit the Temple Mount. I mean, that has been a huge talking point for the Trump administration, and Jared Kushner says that the reason he has made this the sort of centerpiece of their policy vis-a-vis Israel and the Arab world is that they hear from Arabs around the world that they want to come and visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So, I expect there to be tourism from the UAE, just right. Because of that.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Lahav. Thank you for joining us and braving the trumpet playing on my end. I think one of the things first of all, I encourage everyone to look up Lahav's articles on this and other things in the Jerusalem Post and follow her on Twitter. And she's one of the I think social media stars. One of the things
I'm going to my Twitter name in the chat.
Yeah, go for it. Okay, so at Lahav Harkov on Twitter. Excuse me. One of the things I get both from what you said this evening and also from reading you on this is what I think is actually really important, which is that we, that is Israelis and Jews, are so divided right now around Israeli politics, American politics, and other things. And also the sort of traditional left-right divide in Israel and the Palestinian issue, that it's a shame that that's getting in the way of what I think should be seen as a universally great thing, right? You can hate Trump and Netanyahu and still appreciate what a great thing this is. You can think that we should be in peace talks with the Palestinians and be upset that that wasn't part of this, and still accept that this was an extraordinary event and a historic event and has the potential to not just impact Israel but the wider Middle East for the better. And I thank you very much, Lahav, for bringing that to us and educating us. Thank you everyone for joining. Lahav just sent her Twitter name on the chat. I am writing now on Twitter no, sorry, not on Twitter, on the chat. If you want to copy and paste what I've just done, which is the course details for the courses that we're running. As I said, there's a link to the catalog, which is all the courses in Hebrew and English. The second link is to register for one of those courses. And then the final thing is my email address, for which you can ask me questions or join my mailing list if you're not on it. Next week, we'll be hearing from Professor Jonathan Reinhold about the US elections, which will be less than a week away by the time we meet next week. So if everyone that wants to has copied those things. There's a lot of brachot coming in for you, Lahav. Thank you on the chat box. Check that out. But I want to thank everyone for joining. Lahav again, and I wish you all a good evening and a good day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.